Hey everybody, thanks for joining in with me today. I want to show you how to use vertex maps in Blender with the geometry node system to drive simulations and animations. I got my idea from the YouTube creator Eddie, who did this tutorial on how to make Blender look more like Houdini. And he got his idea from this YouTube creator called 3D Bonfire, who did an awesome simulation here in Cinema 4D. And I wanted to recreate this exact simulation in Blender and see how far I can get with it. And yeah, here you can see my results. And I want to show you in this video how I did it and what you can do with the technique in the future. So here in Blender, we have a new project, and I'm not going to delete the default cube this time. Here we are going to make the plus I made for the animation. So I basically took every face on each side and extruded it by 2, by a value of number of 2. So we get this shape, go back out into object mode, Control A and apply the scale, go back into edit mode, select everything, Control B and start beveling it. And then we go here to the small bevel tools, and I'm going to enable clamp overlap. And I used about 20 segments, I think. And now I'm going to play with the width until I have some squares that are all same size. Perfect. This is my plus I made for this simulation, and I think it works really well for what we're doing. Next, I'm going to show you how the magic works and how we're going to use the effect with the vertex maps. For this, we're going down here to the data property tab, and we're going to use 2 groups. We're just creating 2 vertex groups. I'm going to call the first one pin, and the second one I'm going to call it shade. We don't have to apply anything with these, we just have to create them. Next, we are going to need a object, which we will use to use the proximity, but you will see that later. In this case, I'm using a plane. I'm moving it to the side. For our simulation, I would suggest putting it a little more off to the side. Just be sure to check that the face of your object can cover your whole mesh of the plus sign. Then make it a little bit bigger. Also apply the scale. And I am quickly going to animate this with the location here. And the location, let's say frame 80. Go over here and also make a quick keyframe here. Perfect. I will also like always here to go with the letter T and interpolate linear so that we have a nice smooth motion. Perfect. So now we're going to use the geometry nodes tab. In here, we are going to make a new geometry nodes tree for our basic mesh for the plus sign. And I always like to pin it so that we have, when we change settings, we always have it on top. And in here, we are going to use the plane we just created and drag it into our node tree. So we have the object here. And then we're going to use a proximity node. And we're going to use the plane geometry as the target. And if we're going to use Control Shift and left click, we can preview our nodes. And if we're going to use the geometry as well, we can see the position. We see a position of every vertex, but we don't need this in this case. We want to see the distance, and now you can see we get something a little bit more interesting. And if we're now going to use relative, you can see that if we're changing here on the timeline, the scale, that we get this mask, this gradient of where the plane is near to our mesh. Now we can also hide the plane so we can see it a little bit better. And now we're going to use this gradient or this mask that we're creating and outputting it to the vertex maps we just created, to the vertex groups, sorry. And we're going to do this with the distance, and we're going to output it to the group output. And I'm going to do this twice. And when you press N, you get this menu of the nodes. And if you go down here to group, we can see the outputs, and I'm just going to call them here accordingly. The first one I'm going to also call pin, and the second one I'm going to call shade. We're going to use the second one for shading, obviously, and it's very important here that we use a color type instead of a float. The first one, the pin, is a float type, which is correct. And now we're going here into the modifier tab on the output attributes. And here we are selecting accordingly. This is our pin output, so we're using the pin group. And if we go down here to shade, we are using our shade vertex group. And now what you can do to preview this is if you go Control Tab and into weight paint mode, you can see that where our plane is, I mean it's hidden now, but where our plane is, we can see that we are always drawing for every frame this map, this vertex map, which is according to our proximity of the plane. And we can tweak this in a lot of different ways. But first, now let's go to the cloth simulation. For this, I'm just going in here, cloth. And for the effect, you could see in the beginning, which I did for Blender, I have the settings next to me. I'm just going to copy these in here. Something I always like to do is I'm going to turn off gravity, and let's just see what settings I had. I had here 2, 0.25, 0.15. Just going to quickly adjust these. If you're playing around with this, it's always like a lot of different settings. And exactly, these were the settings I was using for my simulation. And now one of the most crucial parts for the simulation, which I did, is down here in the shape tab. So what you can see down here, oops, I nearly forgot, we need to turn on collisions. We don't need object collisions because we don't have any other objects in this scene, but we want to use self collisions for this case. And I'm going to turn this up to 5. Okay, perfect. So let's close this up so that we have everything that we need, which is the shape tab. What I did for my animation or for the simulation is relatively simple. I used the pin group, and the pin group basically, here you can select a vertex group, which we already created. Like we have here the pin and the shade group, and we can, for the pin group, select the pin. And what this does, if you're not really familiar with cloth simulations, it pins down each vertex which is affected by this vertex group. So red in weight paint mode means that we have a value of 1, which is the highest. So our mesh is not going to move anywhere. And if we're scrubbing through the timeline here, we can see where it gets blue. Blue is a value of 0. So here the pin group is not affecting our mesh at all. So here is here it is getting affected like from any forces or whatever we apply to it. So what we're basically doing now is, for a very brief period of time, our mesh is exposed to what are outside forces, whatever forces they are may be. For this case, I will also introduce a force field, a turbulence noise, and because it's very short, everything, we can introduce really, really high values here, like 25,000 or something like this. And if we go back here now to the pin group, something I always like to do as well is here the shrinking factor. If you don't know what the shrinking factor does, basically if the shrinking factor is positive, the mesh will be collapsing inwards to itself. So it has like an implosive behavior. And if the shrinking factor is negative, the mesh will expand when it can. So what I was doing here is, I can show you quickly. If you like set this value to negative 0.5, and if we're going to play our simulation right now, you see that you also can go into weight paint mode to see it a little bit better. Wherever our mesh is blue, green, or yellow, which are the values like between 0 and 1, our mesh is going to be deformed, which already looks really interesting and can be used for a lot of different effects, especially if now let's say using a subdivision surface modifier, we already have some really cool looking mesh. But what I was struggling with when I came up with this solution, that we have here really, really harsh edges. And something we can do is, I always like to crank up the stiffness. This is going to dampen our whole effect a little bit. or yeah, let's say a lot. So the stiffness factor basically holds the mesh back longer. It takes longer for the mesh to deform, but it takes also longer a little bit to get back into shape. So we don't have these harsh edges. But what we have now is the problem that our mesh is still only being deformed in here. And we want, for the animation I did, I wanted to have that the mesh is all still deforming at the end, while the beginning is still forming back to its original state. So what we can do here basically is we are going to use this information, and we're going to use a lot of math nodes. You can use a simple math node in here, and you see if we add something, our value gets smaller and smaller because we don't have zero values anymore. I would be careful when you do this, because what I found out is that the ping group doesn't really like values that are above 1. So if you add a lot of values, the red is still red, but it's calculated above 1, and I had some problems with this when I tested some things out. So we're going to subtract, which hasn't been no problem for me so whatsoever. And you can see if you're using subtract, we can open up the gap between the two ones, also the red ends. And this is quite good already, but what we have now is the problem that we have a lot of room where the value is basically 0, but I want to have a smoother gradient between 1 and 0. So the gradient between 1 and 0, which is colored here in green and yellow, is very shallow. So I wanted to improve on that. So I was going to use a second math node. Oops, wrong one. Yeah, exactly. Now, but we don't need a subtract for this. We just need a multiply, and we're going to multiply with negative values. And now we're going to stretch. Now we're going to stretch this out. And you can see now where our plane would be starting. I can show it here. We already see some force happening. And if we're going to play the animation now, you can see that it smoothly transitions from a solid state where the ping group is affecting to something where our proximity and the plane is affecting. So here you can see, oh, it's doing it. It's getting deformed and then slowly turning back to a solid form. Perfect. This is already pretty good, I think. So now let's say you have a mesh and you have you found a simulation that you really like. I'm going to leave it at this point now, and you want to start rendering it. Then you can go now to the shading tab, and in here we are just simply going to use an attribute node. And if you can recall what we did earlier, we just also created a shade vertex group. And in here, we're just going to use the name shade. And if you're going to preview this on the, oops, I'm sorry, we have to go back to object mode to see this. Yeah, exactly. You can see the color, the vector, and the factor are all showing this map, which is what we created. For this effect, I want to mix two materials. For what I did, basically I used a translucent BSDF and a principled, and I mix shader node, exactly. And I used this as the output, and then I used the factor as the mix factor here. And now for my final render, I used the principled and made a rubber material, and here I used a translucent material with, I think, some orange tint, so that we get this nice effect. And if you want, you can use a color ramp in here as well and adjust the gradient that we get out even more, so we can make a stronger effect, a more harsh effect, or you can narrow it down a little bit more if you want to. And if you're not satisfied with what you get from your animation, you can still go back to the geometry nodes and use, because I forgot it here, I used this transformed mask which we created with the subtract and multiply and used it in the pin output, but we can also of course use it in the shade output. And now here we have an extremely distorted mask, and we can still use it to, let's say, flip it, and then we can have a stronger effect here. And now if we use this for the factor, oops, we are wrong way around, sorry. So yeah, now here we are. You can play with the length and the width of the factor we're having. And yeah, this is basically what I did. Now just frame it and light it, the scene, and you can render out your cool animation. And the cool thing about it is really that everything works procedurally. So if you tweak any settings and anything in the geometry nodes tab, everything works just fine in the end, and you have some really cool animations. So for the end, I wanted to show you guys something really quickly. I really like to follow this company, which is called Man vs. Machine, and they're doing a lot of high quality simulations and 3D stuff for big companies. And recently I found this post from them where they did cloth simulation, really smooth, really high quality, and it really looks great. And I think they did it in Cinema or Cinema 4D or Houdini or something like this, and even stuff like this and this here. And especially this one, the green one and the red one in the beginning, with the technique I showed you guys today, this should be really doable in Blender with the tools we have available. So when we go here, I just prepared this really quickly. When we see I have here a plane, and I used now a wave texture instead of something with a proximity. And if we're going to look at the texture we're getting out, if you animate the face offset, you can get something really similar to what these guys have been doing. If you're doing this, just be careful that your mesh is really subdivided a lot, because it acts as the display for the texture you are going to display on it. So now you can see it's a lot sharper because I subdivided it, but of course you have to be careful whenever you do this for the cloth simulation later on. And also the first one we just watched, if you use an icosphere like I used here, and I duplicated it, and then I joined them together and set the origin in the middle, and I just animated their rotation. If we now look at the proximity which we get, this is basically, I think, what these guys did. And if you now go and play around with the math values to adjust these gradients and use it for a cloth simulation, I'm pretty sure you can get to something like this pretty easily, and something like this as well. If there are any questions at all, please just leave them in the comment section below. I will try to help you guys out in any way I can. And if you guys have any questions, or if you want to see something like this for future tutorials or something like this, just leave a like or tell me in the comments below, and I will make this for you in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.